Hello and welcome back to Storytime Classics Live. I am your host, Bo Heckman. This is produced by Southwest Shakespeare Company. Today we're continuing our incredible story journey, story journey of Hound of the Baskervilles by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes. Holmes is pitted against a spectral beast on the moors, the estate of the Baskerville Manor. There is much that has intrigued Holmes about this case. There is a mysterious person following both Sir Henry Baskerville, the only living Baskerville, and newly arrived from America to assume the head of the Baskerville Manor. He and Dr. Mortimer being the one to initially engage Holmes with this story of the spectral hound and the ancient lineage of the Baskervilles and this curse that has been plaguing them for generations. What I'd like to encourage during all of this, and I guess it was sort of always out there, but I'd like to invite it formally, is discussion, if you would like, on these topics, on Hound of the Baskervilles as we're reading it. Please feel free to make comments of what you think of the story, and hopefully that will lead to a wonderful discussion of this book, which is something that I'd like to encourage as we go along with these series, whether I'm reading or someone else is. We'd like to form a little bit of a discussion on these things. So please, if you do have questions or thoughts on the material, or if you just simply love Sherlock Holmes, tell me what makes Sherlock Holmes special to you. What intrigues? What has made this detective so very popular to be reimagined so many very different times? Most recently, in the spotlight would be the BBC version with Benedict Cumberbatch, which is just an incredible, brilliant retelling of these stories, and the Robert Downey Jr. one. Let's not leave that out. I am a personal fan of all of them. I really think that the very close to the definitive version was the Jeremy Brett series that was done by the BBC in the 80s. If you have a chance to see that, it is incredible, and Jeremy Brett is just about the living personification of Sherlock Holmes. It's an excellent cast, and I just really love how they direct and do everything with that series. And they are very complete. I think they do just about everything in the canon. But having that being said, I love versions like the Benedict Cumberbatch version that is on the BBC, and I believe it's on Netflix if you want to check that out. It's set in modern day, but it really carries over every single theme from the original works. So it's just a brilliant retelling of it. And the Robert Downey Jr. Sherlock Holmes movie series is just plain steampunk fun. It's a different take on Holmes. It's just tons of fun, and it tickles me pink to see it. Yes, you heard me say that. Tickles me pink. So that being said, we're going to go into the story today. Yesterday, we dealt with Sherlock Holmes and Sir Henry Baskerville and Dr. Mortimer meeting with Dr. Watson, and then dispersing, and then Holmes hangs back and watches them walk up the street in this very crowded London street, but he noticed someone watching them. Someone in a cab, not driving the cab, just inside the cab, a dark figure with a beard, and notices Sherlock Holmes watching him and speeds off. And claims, after they talk to the cabman much later, that the guy claims to be Sherlock Holmes himself. Sherlock Holmes feels like he indeed has a worthy opponent this time, because every time Holmes thinks he's getting an advantage, he has to take a few steps back and realize that he is playing with quite a formative opponent on his same mental level. So that's where we are today. And thank you for the light. And we will just go right into that. And again, I encourage comments and discussion as we go along. And we'll just have a great little adventure with that. So here we go into Hound of the Baskervilles, starting with chapter 6, and this is day 3. I encourage you, if you have missed any of the previous installments in this series, you can go to YouTube, to the Southwest Shakespeare page, and find them all there and more. So here we go with Chapter 6, Baskerville Hall. Sir Henry Baskerville and Dr. Mortimer were ready upon the appointed day, and we started as arranged for Devonshire. Mr. Sherlock Holmes drove with me to the station and gave me his last parting injunctions and advice. "I will not bias your mind by suggesting theories or suspicions, Watson," said he. "I wish you simply to report facts in the fullest possible manner to me, and you can leave me to do the theorizing." "What sort of facts?" I asked. Anything that may seem to have a bearing, however indirect, upon the case, and especially the relations between young Baskerville and his neighbors, or any fresh particulars concerning the death of Sir Charles. I have made some inquiries myself in the last few days, but the results have, I fear, been negative. One thing only appears to be certain, and that is that Mr. James Desmond, who is the next heir, is an elderly gentleman of a very amiable disposition, so that this persecution does not arise from him. I really think that we may eliminate him entirely from our calculations. There remain the people who will actually surround Sir Henry Baskerville upon the moor. Would it not be well, in the first place, to get rid of this Barrymore couple? By no means. You could not make a greater mistake. If they are innocent, it would be a cruel injustice. And if they are guilty, we should be giving up all chance of bringing it home to them. No. We will preserve them upon our list. We will preserve them upon our list of suspects. Then there is a groom at the hall. If I remember right, there are 2 moorland farmers. There is our friend, Dr. Mortimer, whom I believe to be entirely honest. There is his wife, of whom we know nothing. There is this naturalist, Stapleton, and there is his sister, who is said to be a young lady of attractions. There is Mr. Franklin of Laughter Hall, who is also an unknown factor, and there are 1 or 2 other neighbors. These are the folk who must be your very special study. You have arms, I suppose? Yes, I thought it as well to take them. Most certainly. Keep your revolver near you night and day, and never relax your precautions. Our friends had already secured a first-class carriage and were waiting for us upon the platform. "No, we have no news of any kind," said Dr. Mortimer, in answer to my friend's questions. "I can swear to one thing, and that is that we have not been shadowed during the last 2 days. We have never gone out without keeping a sharp watch, and no one could have escaped our notice." "You have always kept together, I presume?" "Except yesterday afternoon. I usually give up one day to pure amusement when I come to town, so I spent it at the Museum of the College of Surgeons. And I went to look at the folk in the park," said Baskerville. "But we had no trouble of any kind." "It was imprudent, all the same," said Holmes, shaking his head and looking very grave. "I beg, Sir Henry, that you will not go about alone. Some great misfortune will befall you if you do. Did you get your other boot?" "No, sir. It is gone forever." "Indeed. That is very interesting. Well, goodbye," he added, as the train began to glide down the platform. "Bear in mind, Sir Henry, one of the phrases in that queer old legend which Dr. Mortimer has read to us, and avoid the moor in those hours of darkness when the powers of evil are exalted." I looked back at the platform when we had left it far behind and saw the tall, austere figure of Holmes standing motionless and gazing after us. The journey was a swift and pleasant one, and I spent it in making the more intimate acquaintance of my 2 companions and in playing with Dr. Mortimer's spaniel. In a very few hours, the brown earth had become ruddy, the brick had changed to granite, and red cows grazed in well-hedged fields, where the lush grasses and more luxuriant vegetation spoke of richer, if a damper, climate. Young Baskerville started eagerly out of the window and cried aloud with delight as he recognized the familiar features of the Devon scenery. "I've been over a good part of the world since I left it, Dr. Watson," said he, "but I have never seen a place to compare with it. I never saw a Devonshire man who did not swear by his country," I remarked. "It depends on the breed of men quite as much as on the country," said Dr. Mortimer. "A glance at our friend here reveals the rounded head of the Celt, which carries inside the Celtic enthusiasm and power of attachment. Poor Sir Charles's head was of a very rare type, half Gaelic, half Ivernan in its characteristics. But you were very young when you last saw Baskerville Hall, will you not?" "I was a boy in my teens at the time of my father's death, and I had never seen the hall, for he lived in a little cottage on the south coast. Thence I went straight to a friend in America. I tell you, it is all as new to me as it is to Dr. Watson, and I'm as keen as possible to see the moor." "Are you? Then your wish is easily granted, for there is your first sight of the moor," said Dr. Mortimer, pointing out of the carriage window. Over the green squares of the fields and the low curve of a wood there rose in the distance a grey, melancholy hill with a strange jagged summit, dim and vague in the distance, like some fantastic landscape in a dream. Baskerville sat for a long time, his eyes fixed upon it, and I read upon his eager face how much it meant to him, this first sight of that strange spot where the men of his blood had held sway so long and left their mark so deep. There he sat, with his tweed suit and his American accent, in the corner of a prosaic railway carriage, and yet, as I looked at his dark and expressive face, I felt more than ever how true a descendant he was of that long line of high-blooded, fiery, and masterful men. There were pride, valor, and strength in his thick brows, his sensitive nostrils, and his large hazel eyes. If on that forbidding moor a difficult and dangerous quest should lie before us, this was at least a comrade for whom one might venture to take a risk with the certainty that he would bravely share it. The train pulled up at the small wayside station, and we all descended. Outside, beyond the low white fence, a wagonette with a pair of cobs was waiting. Our coming was evidently a great event, for station master and porters clustered round us to carry out our luggage. It was a sweet, simple country spot, but I was surprised to observe that by the gate there stood two soldierly men in dark uniforms who leaned upon their short rifles and glanced keenly at us as we passed. The coachman, a hard-faced, gnarled little fellow, saluted Sir Henry Baskerville, and in a few minutes we were flying swiftly down the road, White Road. Rolling pasture lands curved upward on either side of us, and old gabled houses peeped out from amid the thick green foliage. But behind the peaceful and sunlit countryside, there rose ever, dark against the evening sky, the long, gloomy curve of the moor, broken by the jagged and sinister hills. The wagonette swung round to a side road, and we curved upward through deep lanes worn by centuries of wheels, high banks on either side, heavy with dripping moss and fleshy hart's-tongue ferns. Bronzing bracken and mottled bramble gleamed in the light of the sinking sun. Still steadily rising, we passed over a narrow granite bridge and skirted a noisy stream which gushed swiftly down, foaming and roaring amid the gray boulders. Both road and stream wound up through a valley dense with scrub oak and fir. At each turn, Baskerville gave an exclamation of delight, looking eagerly about him and asking countless questions. To his eyes all seemed beautiful, but to me a tinge of melancholy lay upon the countryside, which bore so clearly the mark of the waning year. Yellow leaves carpeted the lanes and fluttered down upon us as we passed. The rattle of our wheels died away as we drove through drifts of rotting vegetation, sad gifts, as it seemed to me, for nature to throw before the carriage of the returning heir of the Baskervilles. "Hola!" cried Dr. Mortimer. "What is this?" A steep curve of heath-clad land, an outlying spur of the moor, lay in front of us. On the summit, hard and clear like an equestrian statue upon its pedestal, was a mounted soldier, dark and stern, his rifle poised ready over his forearm. He was watching the road along which we traveled. "What is this, Perkins?" asked Dr. Mortimer. Our driver turned in his seat. "There's a convict escaped from Princetown, sir. He's been out there 3 days now, and the warders watch every road and every situation, but they've had no sight of him yet. The farmers about here don't like it, sir, and that's a fact." "Well, I understand that they get £5 if they can give information." "Yes, sir, but the chance of £5 is but a poor thing compared to the chance of having your throat cut. You see, it isn't like an ordinary convict. This is a man that would stick at nothing." "Who is he, then?" "It's Selden, the Notting Hill murderer." I remembered the case well, for it was one in which Holmes had taken an interest on account of the peculiar ferocity of the crime and the wanton brutality which had marked all the actions of the assassin. The commutation of his death sentence had been due to some doubts as to his complete sanity. So atrocious was his conduct. Our wagonette had topped a rise, and in front of us rose the huge expanse of the moor, mottled with gnarled and craggy cairns and tors. A cold wind swept down from it and sent us shivering. Somewhere there, on the desolate plain, was lurking this fiendish man, hiding in a burrow like a wild beast, his heart full of malignancy against the whole race which had cast him out. It needed but this to complete the grim suggestiveness of the barren waste, the chilling wind, and the darkening sky. Even Baskerville fell silent and pulled his overcoat more closely round him. I would like to just stop and talk about the imagery here. This is incredible. It really is one of the best haunted house kind of stories, or haunted moor. Conan Doyle's description of everything is just so on the nose, and it takes you completely there. Discuss. Going on. We had left the fertile country behind and beneath us. We looked back on it now, the slanting rays of a slow sun turning the streams to threads of gold and glowing on the red earth new turned by the plow and the broad tangle of the woodlands. The road in front of us grew bleaker and wilder over huge russet and olive slopes, sprinkled with giant boulders. Now and then we passed a moorland cottage, walled and roofed with stone, with no creeper to break its harsh outline. Suddenly, we looked down into a cup-like depression, patched with stunted oaks and firs, which had been twisted and bent by the fury of years of storm. 2 high, narrow towers rose over the trees. The driver pointed with his whip. "Baskerville all," said he. Its master had risen and was staring with flushed cheeks and shining eyes. A few minutes later, we had reached the lodge gates, a maze of fantastic tracery in wrought iron, with weather-bitten pillars on either side, blotched with lichens, and surmounted by the boar's heads of the Baskervilles. The lodge was a ruin of black granite and barred ribs of rafters, but facing it was a new building, half constructed, the first fruit of Sir Charles's South African gold. Through the gateway we passed into the avenue, where the wheels were again hushed amid the leaves, and the old trees shot their branches in a somber tunnel over our heads. Baskerville shuddered as he looked up the long, dark drive to where the house glimmered like a ghost at the farther end. "Was it here?" he asked in a low voice. No. The yew alley is on the other side." The young heir glanced round with a gloomy face. "It is no wonder my uncle felt as if trouble were coming on him in such a place as this," said he. "It's enough to scare any man. I'll have a row of electric lamps up here inside of 6 months, and you won't know it again, with 1,000 candle power Swan and Edison right here in front of the hall door." The avenue opened into a broad expanse of turf, and the house lay before us. In the fading light, I could see that the center was a heavy block of building from which a porch projected. The whole front was draped in ivy, with a patch clipped bare here and there, where a window or a coat of arms broke through the dark veil. From this central block rose the twin towers, ancient, crenellated, and pierced with many loopholes. To right and left of the turrets were more modern wings of black granite. A dull light shone through the heavy mulloined windows, and from the high chimneys which rose from the steep, high-angled roof, there sprang a single black column of smoke. "Welcome, Sir Henry! Welcome to Baskerville Hall!" A tall man had stepped from the shadow of the porch to open the door of the wagonette. The figure of a woman was silhouetted against the yellow light of the hall. She came out and helped the man to hand down our bags. "You don't mind my driving straight home, Sir Henry?" said Dr. Mortimer. "My wife is expecting me. Surely we'll stay and have some dinner?" "No, I must go. I shall probably find some work waiting for me. I would stay to show you over to the house, but Barrymore will be a better guide than I. Goodbye, and never hesitate night or day to send for me if I can be of service." The wheels died away down the drive while Sir Henry and I turned into the hall, and the door clanged heavily behind us. It was a fine apartment in which we found ourselves, large, lofty, and heavily raftered with huge bulks of age-blackened oak. In the great old-fashioned fireplace behind the iron dogs, a log fire crackled and snapped. Sir Henry and I held out our hands to it, for we were numb from our long drive. Then we gazed round us at the high, thin window of old stained glass, the oak paneling, the stags' heads, the coats of arms upon the walls, all dim and somber in the subdued light of the central lamp. "It's just as I imagined it," said Sir Henry. "It's not the very picture of an old family home. Is it not the very picture of an old family home? To think that this should be the same hall which for 500 years my people have lived. It strikes me solemn to think of it." I saw his dark face lit up with a boyish enthusiasm as he gazed about him. The light beat upon him where he stood, but long shadows trailed down the halls and hung like a black canopy above him. Barrymore had returned from taking our luggage to our rooms. He stood in front of us now with the subdued manner of a well-trained servant. He was a remarkable-looking man, tall, handsome, with a square black beard and pale, distinguished features. "Would you wish dinner to be served at once, sir?" "Is it ready?" "In a very few minutes, sir. You will find hot water in your rooms. My wife and I will be happy, Sir Henry, to stay with you until you have made your fresh arrangements. But you will understand that under the new conditions, this house will require a considerable staff." "What new conditions?" "I only meant, sir, that Sir Charles led a very retired life, and we were able to look after his wants. You would naturally wish to have more company, and so you will need changes in your household." "Do you mean that your wife and you wish to leave?" "Only when it is quite convenient to you, sir." "But your family have been with us for several generations, have they not? I should be sorry to begin my life here by breaking an old family connection." I seemed to discern some signs of emotion upon the butler's white face. "I feel that also, sir, and so does my wife. But to tell the truth, sir, We were both very much attached to Sir Charles, and his death gave us a shock and made these surroundings very painful to us. I fear that we shall never again be easy in our minds at Baskerville Hall. I have no doubt, sir, that we shall succeed in establishing ourselves in some business. Sir Charles's generosity has given us the means to do so. And now, sir, perhaps I had best show you to your rooms. A square balustraded gallery ran round the top of the old hall, approached by a double stair. From this central point, 2 long corridors extended the whole length of the building, from which all the bedrooms opened. My own was in the same wing as Baskerville's, and almost next door to it. These rooms appeared to be much more modern than the central part of the house, and the bright paper and numerous candles did something to remove the somber expression which our arrival had left upon my mind. But the dining room, which opened out of the hall, was a place of shadow and gloom. It was a long chamber with a step separating the dais where the family sat from the lower portion reserved for their dependents. At one end, a minstrel's gallery overlooked it. Black beams shot across above our heads, with a smoke-darkened ceiling beyond them. With rows of flaring torches to light it up, and the color of rude hilarity of an old-time banquet, it might have softened. But now, when 2 black-clothed clothed gentlemen sat in the little circle of light thrown by a shaded lamp, one's voice became hushed and one's spirit subdued. A dim line of ancestors in every variety of dress, from the Elizabethan knight to the buck of the Regency, stared down upon us and daunted us by their silent company. We talked little, and I, for one, was glad when the meal was over and we were able to retire to the modern billiard room and smoke a cigarette. "My word, it isn't a very cheerful place," said Sir Henry. "I suppose one can tone it down, but I feel a bit out of the picture at present. I don't wonder that my uncle got a little jumpy if he lived all alone in such a house as this. However, if it suits you, we will retire early tonight, and perhaps things may seem more cheerful in the morning." I drew aside my curtains before I went to bed, and looked out from my window. It opened upon the grassy space which lay in front of the hall door. Beyond, 2 corpses of trees moaned and swung in a rising wind. A half-moon broke through the rifts of racing clouds. In its cold light, I saw beyond the trees a broken fringe of rocks and the long, low curve of the melancholy moor. I closed the curtain, feeling that my last impression was in keeping with the rest. And yet it was not quite the last. I found myself weary and yet wakeful, tossing restlessly from side to side, seeking for the sleep which would not come. Far away, a chiming clock struck out the quarters of the hours, but otherwise a deathly silence lay upon the old house. And then, suddenly, in the very dead of the night, there came a sound to my ears, clear, resonant, and unmistakable. It was the sob of a woman, the muffled, strangling gasp of one who is torn by an uncontrollable sorrow. I sat up in bed and listened intently. The noise could not have been far away, and was certainly in the house. For half an hour I waited with every nerve on the alert, but there came no other sound save the chiming of the clock and the rustle of the ivory on the wall. Chapter 7. The Stapletons of Merripit House. The fresh beauty of the following morning did something to efface from our minds the grim and grey impression which had been left upon both of us by our first experience of Baskerville Hall. As Sir Henry and I sat at breakfast, the sunlight flooded in through the high mullioned windows, throwing watery patches of color from the coats of arms which covered them. The dark paneling glowed like bronze in the golden rays, and it was hard to realize that this was indeed the chamber which had struck such a gloom into our souls upon the evening before. "I guess it is ourselves and not the house that we have to blame," said the baronet. "We are tired with our journey and chilled by our drive, so we took a grave view of the place. Now we are fresh and well, so it is all cheerful once more." "And yet it was not entirely a question of imagination," I answered. "Did you, for example, happen to hear someone, a woman, I think, sobbing in the night?" "That is curious, for I did, when I was half asleep, fancy that I heard something of the sort. I waited quite a time, but there was no more of it, so I concluded that it was all a dream. I heard it distinctly, and I am sure that it was really the sob of a woman. We must ask about this right away." He rang the bell and asked Barrymore whether he could account for our experience. It seemed to me that the pallid features of the butler turned a shade paler still as he listened to his master's question. "There are only 2 women in the house, Sir Henry," he answered. "One is the scullery maid, who sleeps in the other wing. The other is my wife, and I can answer for it that the sound would not have come from her." And yet he lied as he said it, for it chanced that after breakfast I met Mrs. Barrymore in the long corridor with the sun full upon her face. She was a large, impassive, heavy-featured woman with a stern-set expression of mouth, but her telltale eyes were red and glanced at me from between swollen lids. It was she, then, who wept in the night, and if she did so, her husband must know it. Yet he had taken the obvious risk of discovery in declaring that it was not so. Why had he done this? And why did she weep so bitterly? Already round this pale-faced, handsome, black-bearded man there was gathering an atmosphere of mystery and of gloom. It was he who had been the first to discover the body of Sir Charles, and we had had only his word for all the circumstances which led up to the old man's death. Was it possible that it was Barrymore, after all, whom we had seen in the cab in Regent Street? The beard might well have been the same. The cabman had described a somewhat shorter man, but such an impression might easily have been erroneous. How could I settle the point forever? Obviously, the first thing to do was to see the Grimpen postmaster and find whether the test telegram had really been placed in Barrymore's own hands. Be the answer what it might, I should at least have something to report to Sherlock Holmes. Sir Henry had numerous papers to examine after breakfast, so that the time was propitious for my excursion. It was a pleasant walk of 4 miles along the edge of the moor, leading me at last to a small grey hamlet, in which 2 larger buildings, which proved to be the inn and the house of Dr. Mortimer, stood high above the rest. The postmaster, who was also the village grocer, had a clear recollection of the telegram. "Certainly, sir," said he. "I had the telegram delivered to Mr. Barrymore exactly as directed." "Who delivered it?" "My boy here, James. You delivered that telegram to Mr. Barrymore at the hall last week, did you not?" "Yes, father, I delivered it." "Into his own hands?" I asked. "Well, he was up in the loft at the time, so I could not put it into his own hands, but I gave it to Mrs. Barrymore's hands, and she promised to deliver it at once." "Did you see Mr. Barrymore?" "No, sir. I tell you that he was in the loft." "If you didn't see him, how do you know he was in the loft?" "Well, surely his own wife ought to know where he is," said the postmaster testily. "Didn't he get the telegram? If there is any mistake, it is for Mr. Barrymore himself to complain." It seemed hopeless to pursue the inquiry any farther, but it was clearer in that in spite of Holmes' ruse, we had no proof that Barrymore had not been in London all the time. Suppose that it were so. Suppose that the same man had been the last who had seen Sir Charles alive, and the first to dog the new heir when he returned to England. What then? Was he the agent of others, or had he some sinister design of his own? What interest would he have in persecuting the Baskerville family? I thought of the strange warning clipped out and of leading the article in the Times. Was that his work, or was it possibly the doing of someone who is bent upon counteracting his schemes? The only conceivable motive was that which had been suggested by Sir Henry, that if the family could be scared away, a comfortable and permanent home would be secured for the Barrymores. But surely such an explanation as that would be quite inadequate to account for the deep and subtle scheming which seemed to be weaving an invisible net around the young baronet. Holmes himself had said that no more complex case had come to him in all the long series of his sensational investigations. I prayed, as I walked back along the grey, lonely road, that my friend might soon be freed from his preoccupations and be able to come down to take this heavy burden of responsibility from my shoulders. Suddenly, my thoughts were interrupted by the sound of running feet behind me and a voice which called me by my name. I turned, expecting to see Dr. Mortimer, but to my surprise, it was a stranger who was pursuing me. He was a small, slim, clean-shaven, prim-faced man, flaxen-haired and lean-jawed, between 30 and 40 years of age, dressed in a grey suit and wearing a straw hat. A tin box for botanical specimens hung over his shoulder, and he carried a green butterfly net in one of his hands. "You will, I am sure, excuse my presumption, Dr. Watson," said he as he came panting up where I stood. "Here on the moor we are homely folk and do not wait for formal introductions. You may possibly have heard my name from our mutual friend, Mortimer. I am Stapleton of Merripit House." "Your net and box would have told me as much," said I, for I knew that Mr. Stapleton was a naturalist. "But how did you know me?" "I have been calling on Mortimer, and he pointed you out to me from the window of his surgery as you passed. As our road lay the same way, I thought that I would overtake you and introduce myself. I trust that Sir Henry is none the worse for his journey." "He is very well, thank you." We were all rather afraid that after the sad death of Sir Charles, the new baronet might refuse to live here. It is asking much of a wealthy man to come down and bury himself in a place of this kind. But I need not tell you that it means a very great deal to the countryside. Sir Henry has, I suppose, no superstitious fears in the matter? "I do not think that is likely. Of course, you know the legend of the fiend dog which haunts the family." "I have heard it." "It is extraordinary how credulous the peasants are about here. Any number of them are ready to swear that they have seen such a creature upon the moor." He spoke with a smile, but I seemed to read in his eyes that he took the matter more seriously. The story took a great hold upon the imagination of Sir Charles, and I have no doubt that it led to this tragic end. But how? His nerves were so worked up that the appearance of any dog might have had a fatal effect upon his diseased heart. I fancy that he really did see something of the kind upon that last night in the yew alley. I feared that some disaster might occur, for I was very fond of the old man, and I knew that his heart was weak." "Well, how did you know that?" "My friend Mortimer told me." "You think, then, that some dog pursued Sir Charles, and that he died of fright in consequence?" "I have not come to any conclusions." "Has Mr. Sherlock Holmes—" The words took away my breath for an instant, but a glance at the placid face of steadfast eyes of my companion showed me that no surprise was intended. "It is useless for us to pretend that we do not know you, Dr. Watson," said he. "The records of your detective have reached us here, and you could not celebrate him without being known yourself. When Mortimer told me your name, he could not deny your identity. If you are here, then it follows that Mr. Sherlock Holmes is interesting himself in the matter, and I am naturally curious to know what view he may take." "I am afraid that I cannot answer that question." "May I ask if he's going to honor us with a visit himself?" "He cannot leave town now at present." "He has other cases which engage his attention." "What a pity. He might throw some light on that which is so dark to us. But as to your own researches, if there is any possible way in which I can be of service to you, I trust that you will command me." If I had any indication of the nature of your suspicions, or how you propose to investigate the case, I might perhaps even now give you some aid or advice. I assure you that I am simply here upon a visit to my friend, Sir Henry, and that I need no help of any kind." "Excellent," said Stapleton. "You are perfectly right to be wary and discreet. I am justly reproved for what I feel was an unjustifiable intrusion, and I promise you that I will not mention the matter again." We had come to a point where a narrow grassy path struck off from the road and would away across the moor. A steep, boulder-sprinkled hill lay upon the right, which had in bygone days been cut into a granite quarry. The face, which was turned towards us, formed a dark cliff, with ferns and brambles growing in its niches. From over a distant rise, there floated a grey plume of smoke. "A moderate walk along this moor path brings us to Merripit House," said he. "Perhaps you will spare an hour, that I may have the pleasure of introducing you to my sister." My first thought was that I should be by Sir Henry's side, but then I remembered the pile of papers and bills with which his study table was littered, and I was certain that I could not help with those. And Holmes had expressly said that I should study the neighbors upon the moor. I accepted Stapleton's invitation, and we turned together down the path. "It is a wonderful place, the moor," said he, looking round over the undulating downs, long green rollers with crests of jagged granite foaming up into fantastic surges. "You never tire of the moor. You cannot think the wonderful secrets which it contains. It is so vast, so barren, and so mysterious." "You know it well, then?" "I have only been here 2 years. The residents would call me a newcomer. We came shortly after Sir Charles settled. But my tastes led me to explore every part of the country round, and I should think that there are few men who know it better than I do." "Is it hard to know?" "Very hard. You see, for example, this great plain to the north here, with the queer hills breaking out of it. Do you observe anything remarkable about that?" "It would be a rare place for a gallop." "You would naturally think so, and the thought has cost several their lives before now. You notice those bright green spots scattered thickly over it?" "Yes, they seem more fertile than the rest." Stapleton laughed. "That is the great Grimpen Mire," said he. "A false step yonder means death to man or beast. Only yesterday I saw one of the Moor ponies wander into it. He never came out. I saw his head for quite a long time, craning out of the bog hole, but it sucked him down at last. Even in dry seasons, it is a danger to cross it. But after these autumn rains, it is an awful place, and yet I can find my way in the very heart of it and return alive. By George, there is another of those miserable ponies." Something brown was rolling and tossing among the green sledges. Then a long, agonized, writhing neck shot upward, and a dreadful cry echoed over the moor. It turned me cold with horror, but my companion's nerves seemed to be stronger than mine. "It's gone," said he. "The mire has him. 2 in 2 days, and many more, perhaps, for they get in the way of going there in the dry weather and never know the difference until the mire has them in its clutches. It's a bad place, the great Grimpen Mire." "And you say you can penetrate it?" "Yes. There are 1 or 2 paths which a very active man can take. I have found them out." "But why should you wish to go into such a horrible place?" "Well, you see the hills beyond? They are really islands cut off on all sides by the impassable mire, which has crawled round them in the course of years. That is where the rare plants and the butterflies are. If you have the wit to reach them, I shall try my luck some day." He looked at me with a surprised face. "For God's sake, put such an idea out of your mind," said he. "Your blood would be upon my head. I assure you that there would not be the least chance of your coming back alive. It is only by remembering certain complex landmarks that I am able to do it." "Hola!" I cried. "What is that?" A long, low moan, indescribably sad, swept over the moor. It filled the whole air, and yet it was impossible to say whence it came. From a dull murmur it swelled into a deep roar, and then sank back into a melancholy, throbbing murmur once again. Stapleton looked at me with a curious expression in his face. "Queer place, the Moor," said he. "But what is that?" "The peasants say it is the hound of the Baskervilles calling for its prey. I have heard it once or twice before, but never quite so loud." I looked round, with a chill of fear in my heart, at the huge swelling plain, mottled with green patches of rushes. Nothing stirred over the vast expanse save for a pair of ravens, which croaked loudly from a tor behind us. "You are an educated man. You don't believe such nonsense as that," said I. "What do you think of this? What do you think is the cause of so strange a sound?" "Bogs make queer noises sometimes. It's the mud settling or the water rising or something." No, that was a living voice." "Well, perhaps it was. Did you ever hear a bittern booming? "No, I never did. It's a very rare bird, practically extinct in England now, but all things are possible upon the moor. Yes, I should not be surprised to learn that what we have heard is the cry of the last of the bitterns. It is the weirdest, strangest thing that I heard in my life. Yes, it is rather an uncanny place altogether. Look at the hillside yonder. What do you make of those?" The whole steep slope was covered with grey circular rings of stone, a score of them at least. "What are they? Sheep pens? No, they are homes of our worthy ancestors. Prehistoric man lived thickly on the moor, and as no one in particular has lived there since, we'll find all his little arrangements exactly as he left them. These are his wigwams with the roofs off. You can even see his hearth and his couch if you have the curiosity to go inside. But it is quite a town when it was inhabited. Neolithic man, no date." And we will stop here and pick up right where we left off with what did he do? I would like to see now if we have any comments or if anyone would like to discuss where we are in the story. It is very interesting, and the imagery of the Moors is so tangible. I really do feel like I'm there, that I can smell the smells, and I can see in my mind's eye what it is like on this extremely peaceful yet terrifying landscape. So if anyone would like to write in on Facebook or on YouTube there, we can monitor those discussions throughout the day if you would like, until next reading tomorrow, and hopefully form a great little discussion about this book. As I do not see any comments at the current time, we will probably wrap things up today. We will wrap things up today. And we will be back tomorrow with more of Hound of the Baskervilles. And hopefully we'll have some questions and answers and more of a little bit of a discussion going along with this book, because I think it would be really, really fascinating to get people talking about it. So please tune in again tomorrow and come with questions. You are completely allowed to read ahead. If you are going outside today, please be safe and please wear a mask. Thank you, and we'll see you again tomorrow with your questions.